All right, this is chapter 2, part 1. In this chapter, we're going to cover concepts of law and morality. So this is a section where we're getting into some of the basic, sort of almost philosophical ideas about the criminal justice system, about law in particular, and related concepts. The first point that we'll make here, again drawn from chapter 2, is that the main reason we have criminal justice agencies is to maintain order. And you'll hear agencies, especially law enforcement, talking about here where an important service that we offer is to try to preserve order, maintain order, keep the streets safe. And so that's certainly an important goal of the criminal justice system. And it's not, when we talk about order, it's not just preventing or stopping or punishing crime, but also other sorts of sources of disorder. So mobs and riots, and even things like natural disasters of different types. Those introduce chaos and disorder into society. And so the criminal justice system is tasked with keeping things peaceful and orderly, and so it goes well beyond just crime. Now, one of the most important concepts about order and the sort of attempts to justify the criminal justice system we see in this very old idea called social contract theory. It's the view that we give up some of our freedom and institute government in exchange for more security. So this idea goes back centuries to political thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, who was an English scholar, who argued that the state of nature, when you don't have humans instituting government of some sort, you're in a state of nature, and the state of nature is very violent, is brutal, is basically a war of all against all. That the idea that if you don't have some institutionalized force to stop predators, people exploiting other people, you're going to get a lot of that. Is what someone like what Hobbes would say. And so because the state of nature is so dangerous and you're so likely to be victimized by it, that the social contract theory says, well, what we do is we're willing to give up some of our liberties, some of our freedom, because the government does take away some of our liberties and freedom. We can't do whatever we want. We have laws, we have the system, we have police officers who don't allow certain behavior, and you can get stopped and questioned and arrested and prosecuted for violations of certain laws and engaging in certain kinds of behavior. So you can't do whatever you want in a society with the government. So we give away some of that freedom and do whatever we want in exchange for some security, some protection against the dangers from nature, the natural state of things, security that can be provided by the government. So that's really, according to this sort of perspective, that's really government's number one job, is you've given up your liberty in exchange for safety. So the government is supposed to provide safety, security, peace, so that you can move about, do your business unmolested, not victimized. So this is still, even as old as this idea is, it's still one that people rely on to sort of answer the question, where does government get the right to take away our freedoms and tell us we can't do X, Y, and Z? Well, the answer that's most often given is this social contract theory, that we give up some freedom in exchange for more security. Okay, but so, most people would probably agree that government is necessary and that we need help being protected because there are dangers out there. But much of the ongoing debate of how intrusive the government should be, this is an example of how far we take the social contract. How far do we want to take this? How much liberty do we want to give up for how much safety and security? You've seen this debate rage for quite a few years, especially since 9/11. After 9/11, the United States formed the Department of Homeland Security. We were much more concerned about counterterrorism. They beefed up things at airports where you get checked by the TSA, and you have to stand in lines, and you have to take your shoes off and your belt off and all these things when you go through airport security. And so, some people say, hey, they've gone too far in sort of violating my rights or invading my privacy, surveilling me in different ways, in trying to keep us safe. They've gone too far, some people would say, right? So there's always this debate where you draw the line. How much security are we going for? How much safety? And how much freedom are we willing to give up? Public opinion evolves on this in different times, in different states across the country. Different individuals have different attitudes on this, and things tend to change over time. Things have gotten more, in a sense, they've gotten more pro-security after 9/11. People became very fearful of terrorist activity. So that's been a trend in the direction of greater safety and security. But I think I would say it's a complicated thing, but I would say in quite a few ways that our society has evolved in the past few decades, more in what we would call a libertarian direction, which means a libertarian view is that we should have as much as little government intrusion and intervention as possible. You should have minimal government. People should be maximally free without government telling them what to do very much. That's the libertarian position, minimal government. And in some ways, I think that we have moved in a more libertarian direction when it comes to the idea of, well, people should be able to do freely what they want to do, even if I don't personally like it or I'm not personally into that myself. That let's live and let live, and encourage and really hold up as being important the value of sort of tolerance, right? So I think that it's a complicated thing, but I think in some important ways we've moved in a more keep government out of it sort of direction. But again, it's complicated. Now, this term legitimacy is important because legitimacy exists when citizens accept that their government has the right to govern them. So legitimacy refers to the feeling on the part of the public, ordinary citizens, that their government has legitimate authority, that indeed we know it has a lot of power, it has a lot of power to do different things, but to have legitimate power means it's power that's used correctly, that it's justified, that the government deserves to have the power that it is, and that we respect their power, respect their authority, and we're on their side, sort of. We support what they're doing. And this is something that all governments, even non-democratic governments, even dictatorships to some extent, have to be worried about how the public views the government. If the public totally rejects the government as being illegitimate, that unjust, that we don't respect what you're doing, we'd like to see you thrown out and replaced with a more just government, a more just system. Well, even dictators have a problem if that's how most people feel about them. This is where revolutions come from, instability on the part of the government. You need to try to convince people that you're doing a good job and that what you're doing should be respected and followed. So legitimacy is an important issue in all this talk about law, etc. Okay, now when talking about law, there's a couple of Latin terms here that we want to be familiar with. Again, we'll have throughout the semester, we'll have Latin terms since we draw upon the Roman legal tradition to some extent. So there's the formal laws as written on the books, and so that's called like law de jure or de jure. I'm not going to worry about pronunciation, but that's how you find laws formally existing. But there's also a law as it's sort of practice on the streets, how it's actually lived and how it's enforced or not enforced in real life, how it's experienced by people, and that's de facto. So realize that and this is true for many things, not even just a law, that you'll have an organization that has policies, procedures, going by the book sort of thing. You have that aspect of policies. But then you have how people actually behave and actually do their jobs or go about their business. And there can be a gap between what it says in the books and what you actually see an institution or organization actually doing. So that's kind of an important distinction, because we don't always go by the book, even with very serious things like the law. The law sometimes will say one thing, but then how we apply it could be something, fairly different. Now, we talked about how a main priority of criminal justice is maintaining order, but nowadays it's really not considered enough just to keep the peace. In modern societies, there grows to be higher expectations of the system. So the public demands will say, hey, we don't want you just to keep the streets peaceful. We want to see our values followed and made as priorities, values like fairness, equality, effectiveness. And so you see in modern times, when it comes to the criminal justice system, we have higher expectations, we expect more, and we're more judging of how the criminal justice system and its various branches are performing, how they're doing. If they're not doing well, we're likely to criticize, and we just have, compared to people in the past, we tend to expect more. So more than just order, these other values are considered important as well nowadays. People often focus on results. While it's true that we of course we want fairness and justice and equal treatment, but we do, when we look at, people tend to be pretty practical, and they like to see results too. So if they do feel that their communities are safe, that crime is low, that people are not being victimized, then people are going to recognize that and tend to be quite happy with that. If you're doing your job well, people recognize that. They look at results. Researchers, one thing you're going to see about this discipline of criminology, criminal justice, is that researchers tend to focus more on the process. Are the steps that the criminal justice system follow, are they fair? They look at issues the researchers tend to focus a lot on fairness, and is the procedure fair and just and proper or not, and tend to focus a little bit less than, say, your ordinary citizen who'll just be like, hey, well, the streets, the streets seem pretty safe. It seems like crime's pretty low, so I'm pretty satisfied. The researchers tend to look at how the system is operating and look at issues of fairness, and frankly, looking at sort of fairness towards suspects, towards people accused of crimes. Are they being treated fairly? Are they getting due process? Are they getting justice? That's something that researchers probably think more about and are more worried and concerned and study more than possibly anyway the typical citizen, who tends to focus on results. Now, according to American philosopher Charles Peirce, there are 4 ways that we come to know what we know. Number 1 is tenacity, is believing something through stubbornness, just because, usually we hold on very strongly to whatever beliefs we have. We're taught certain things when we're young, when we're growing up, and those things that we're taught, we tend to hold on to those just because that's human nature, and that's the way we tend to operate, is we tend to believe what we already believe and tend to stick with that regardless. And so Peirce refers to that as tenacity. Number 2 is authority, and by authority we mean that we tend to defer to people who know more than we do, and trust that they're giving us the truth, that they're giving us valid information. So we might rely on a scientist because, well, the scientist knows all this all this technical stuff that I don't understand. So since I don't really understand it, I'm going to defer to them and trust that they're telling me the truth. So that's a very common way, because we are, any one person's experience is very limited, and so you can't know everything. You can't know all corners of the globe. You're just one person. So very often we're relying on other sources of information, whether it be the news or what we learn in school, or it could be also religious beliefs, for example. Again, beliefs about just about anything, you probably got most of those beliefs from other people, and personalized them, made them your own, but still, a lot of what we get from others that we would call authorities. Now, number 3 here is common sense. And by common sense, we mean belief through intuition. And by intuition, that again is probably not quite as clear as the word common sense is. But what we mean is that it's kind of gut feeling, that you just kind of sense, well, that seems kind of obvious. When somebody makes a statement and it seems obvious to you, it seems very clear. And if someone says, well, why does it seem clear to you? You say, well, it just looks like it's an obvious kind of thing. Well, that's an example of what we mean by common sense or intuition, that it just appears clear and obvious to people, right? And of course, we rely on that for much of what we know. Now, the reason why we are going through these is we want to talk about the approach that researchers, all this stuff that you're going to get this semester about criminal justice, this comes from researchers. And researchers tend to have a little bit different focus than these first 3. Researchers tend to have more focus on this number 4, empiricism, which is related to the idea of a scientific approach of learning things or knowing things. And that is learning about things through careful observation, through things like collecting information carefully, systematically, thoroughly, collecting data and analyzing data to look to see, beyond just what my own hunch or my own opinions are, but what are the facts out there. And so researchers tend to be very thorough and systematic about gathering facts together so that they can draw conclusions that are based on data, so this is an empirical approach. Most of us in our own lives, we kind of do this at a low level too. If you see things, you believe them, right? If you experience things, you're going to be more likely to believe it. Problem is that we're really limited. Again, we can't see all things all the time. We're only one person in one place at one time. And so the scientific empirical approach goes way beyond personal experience and collects data from sources where you're not personally observing this stuff. And so there's an advantage there that is going beyond just a person, one or two individuals' personal experiences. Is much bigger than that. So, number 2 is that we also, as individuals, don't really have time to be thinking about and studying every little thing so in depth and so systematically. We have lives to live, so we don't really have time to be scientists about everything. So anyway, but among researchers, though, they that's part of their job, and so they have the time to study these things carefully. Okay, well, the public tend to rely on the first 3 ways of knowing things. Criminologists and researchers in general, in any scientific endeavor, scientists tend to rely on this empirical approach. Now, let's not take that too far, though, because all researchers are human beings too, just like everybody else, and they tend to fall back on these other sources of knowledge too. So, don't make the mistake of thinking that this stuff that you read in the textbooks is all God's truth and is purely scientific and empirical. There's a lot of mixed human stuff in there as well. So you always want to sort of keep an open mind, but also sort of a skeptical mind and challenge and question things that are coming to you from, say, this course, other courses, books you read, stuff you get exposed to, because everything has a human element to it, and bias and imperfection and all that. And so you want to be sort of an aware, skeptical person who just doesn't swallow everything that comes along. Now, there's 2 types of statements that, and if I recall, this doesn't come from the textbook. This This is stuff I've added in. So make sure that these two statements, positive statements and normative statements, that you understand the difference between these two. It's can be a little bit tricky the first time you hear this. Positive statements refer to statements about material reality. It just means the real world, the physical, world that we live in. And so a statement, for example, a positive statement would be that the moon revolves around the Earth, right? That's a claim about facts about the real world, the physical world out there. That's what I mean by material reality. It's just the real world out there. It's a claim, it's a statement about how things are out there. The moon goes around the Earth. It can be true or false in the sense that is it really that way or is it not, right? Is the reality that or something else? So positive statements deal with that kind of stuff, and that's what science and researchers are able to study, is to test to see if these sorts of statements about material reality, if they're true or not. So we'll use scientific methods to find out, indeed, is it true that the Earth, that the moon goes around the Earth, kind of thing, or that the Earth goes around the sun. Those are things that Earth going around the sun is something that was debated for a long time, and there was for long periods of time, going back far enough, people thought that the Earth didn't move and that the sun went around the Earth. So so you use science to figure out, well, what's the truth, right? You use empirical methods, you gather data, and you test your theories, and you find out what's correct and what's not correct. That's science. So science deals with testing whether these positive statements are correct, true or not true. Normative statements, on the other hand, those are statements about right versus wrong. And that's something that a scientific approach cannot answer those kind of questions. Not at all. You might think that science can tell you everything. It cannot. Science cannot. A scientific approach is not going to be able to tell you whether something is morally right or morally wrong. It's a different reality. It's a different thing. It's not this material reality, this physical reality. We're talking about stuff in the universe, matter and energy and all that kind of stuff that science studies. We're talking about morality, right and wrong. And science can't tell you that this is bad or this is good. That's got to come from other sources. It's got to come from sources like philosophy and ethics, from religious traditions, from people's sort of discussing and trying to come up with a reasonable sense of right versus wrong. There's other sources that we use to figure out what's right versus wrong morally, but science isn't going to do that for you. So it's important to talk about this because you're going to get the scientific approach all semester, but you need to know that science is limited. It can't tell you everything. It's only going to be able to weigh in and point in the right direction about what's going on in the world. So a scientific approach is effective at evaluating positive statements, but cannot prove normative statements valid or invalid. So if you have some normative statement like it's wrong to steal from other people, we might all say, well, that's kind of obvious. We all know that. But science isn't going to be able to prove that. Science can't prove that it's bad or good. We have to use, because science is about material reality, about studying stuff. And you can study people too. You can study people's behavior, for example. But again, what science can't do is make moral decisions of this is right versus that. So that's an important thing to realize up front. But sometimes, and to be honest, sometimes scientists and researchers will sneak in their own values, their own beliefs about right and wrong, into their scientific activities. A lot of times you'll see this get mixed together, and that's not proper. That's not, at least if the scientist is not being honest, and if they're acting like they're scientific, like their values are scientific in the same way that their research findings are scientific, well, that's inaccurate. That's inaccurate. Again, values, moral beliefs, moral rightness versus wrongness, that's something different than science. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Now, I'm going to go ahead and stop right here, where the next thing we get into is these stages of moral development. I'm actually going to skip that, but we'll pick it up, and I'll show you where we're going to pick up in the next segment.